All right, so I think everyone's got their food. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to the Animal Law Society and the Harvard Divinity School for helping sponsor this event. I'm Chris Green. I'm the Executive Director of the Animal Law and Policy Program here at the Law School. And if any of you haven't already, you should sign up for the Animal Law Society's mailing list so they will keep you updated about other future events like this. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor David Clough to join us today. He's a professor of theological ethics at the University of Chester in the UK, and today he'll be speaking about the challenge of Christian animal ethics. The event is part of a tour for his new book, On Animals, Volume 2, which just came out, and will focus on what does the Christian faith mean for how we treat animals, especially in our use of them for food. One reviewer described Professor Clough's On Animals books as, quote, indisputably the most important and comprehensive theological treatment of animals to have appeared in any language at any time in the Christian tradition. Okay. 3 stars. Another said the volumes were the most significant Christian theological and ethical treatment of animals in the history of Christian ethics that will have a revolutionary impact on lived Christian behavior. Again, pretty decent reviews. Professor Clough just finished his term as president of the Society for the Study of Christian Ethics and also is the founder of the Creature Kind Project, through which he seeks to engage churches in the UK and the United States by framing farmed animal welfare as a faith issue. David also is a Methodist lay preacher and has represented the Methodist Church on national ecumenical working groups on the ethics of warfare and climate change as well. Professor Clough earned his PhD in religious ethics from some place called Yale, and joined us here at HLS in 2016 to participate in a workshop we held on animals, law, and religion. We have the room until 2 p.m., so after the talk, David will be selling and signing copies of his books, some of which are only available in paperback on this tour. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Clough.
Thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation to come and address you. Thanks for the groups that have sponsored this talk. And thanks to you all for coming. I'm delighted to see you. And it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to address you today. I've spent most of the last decade or so producing the 568 pages that go into those 2 volumes. And now that they're written and published, I want to get out as widely as possible to discuss the core conclusion of the work as a whole, which I'm calling the challenge of Christian animal ethics. What's that challenge, I hear you ask? Well, I feel I should offer a spoiler alert at this point. If you're planning to read these books and you're the kind of person who doesn't like to know the ending in advance, you probably want to shut your ears at this point. Come to think of it, perhaps giving away the ending isn't good for book sales either. Oh well. The core conclusion of this entire 2-volume work is this. Perhaps that's not entirely clear and needs a little bit more explanation. I want to suggest that there is an abyss. The abyss that I'm trying to characterize is between the kinds of treatment of other animals required by a Christian understanding of their place in God's purposes and the way we treat other animals at the moment. This abyss, I want to argue, is huge. We're currently acting in ways that completely disregard the status of other animals as fellow animal creatures of the God Christians worship. In this lecture, my aim is to convince you that this abyss exists, and then convince you there's something we can do about it, and then convince you to do it. If by the end I haven't convinced you of that, I'd like you to put up your hand and tell me why. And if I have convinced you, I'd like to point you to the first practical steps in taking up the challenge I'm laying before you. Here goes. So that's what lies ahead for us in the next 45 minutes or so. First, I want to explain why I think it's worth our time to consider what we're doing to other animals when there are so many other pressing issues also demanding our attention. I suppose your presence here means you're at least open to considering the possibility, but perhaps you're skeptical about my proposal that animal ethics should be an important current concern for Christians or others. I don't blame you in relation to that question, and I want to start by making the case that animal ethics is worth our time. Second, I want to set out why animals should matter for Christians in particular. The atheistic utilitarian Peter Singer, author of the landmark work Animal Liberation in the late 1970s, thinks Christianity provides the foundation for an ethic that excludes moral regard for other animals. He's persuaded a lot of angry atheistic vegans that he's right. Perhaps you've had the pleasure of running into some of them. I certainly have. Worse, Singer also seems to have persuaded large numbers of Christians that their faith gives them reasons to be unconcerned about animals. I think he's wrong. I've told him so, and told him that if he wants for utilitarian reasons to persuade Christians to treat animals better, he should stop telling them to give up believing in God and the Bible first. To his credit, he listened carefully and then agreed to endorse On Animals, Volume 1, Systematic Theology. I think there's not many works of Christian theology that Peter Singer has endorsed, so I count that as a badge of honor. That first volume considers where animals belong in Christian doctrines of creation, reconciliation, and redemption, and the second part of this lecture gallops quickly through some key points of the argument I developed there, with the aim of convincing you that Christians indeed have strong faith-based reasons for being concerned about animals. Third, I want to present some snapshots of what we're currently doing to other animals. On Animals Volume 2 presents an extensive survey of what we're doing to other animals in our use of them for food, textiles, labour, research experimentation, sport and entertainment, pets and companions, and our impacts on wild animals. Part 3 of this lecture will focus on the use we make of other animals for food, not just because I need to leave some material undiscussed as motivation for you to buy my wonderful book, but also because I argue that in scale, intensity, and impact, our use of animals for food should be our priority concern. Together, parts 2 and 3 of the lecture are my case for the existence of this abyss between the kind of treatment of other animals that a Christian understanding of them requires and what we're currently doing. Fourthly, after hopefully convincing you of the existence of this abyss, I turn to what we could do in response and propose 2 key practical strategies. I'll keep you in suspense about those as an incentive to stay awake for part 4, which I estimate is about 30 minutes away. If you need to count, hang in there. And that's what I'll be trying to convince you that there's something we can do about the abyss that I've convinced you exists in part 2 and 3. Fifth, as I encourage my students to do in writing their essays, I consider some counter-arguments. I'm sure you'll have your critical faculties fully engaged throughout, which will mean by part 5 you'll have your head full of complexities I haven't paid attention to. My aim in part 5 is to bravely attempt to enter into the murky recesses of those critical faculties, to anticipate some of the questions and perform the high wire act of responding to them before you've even put them to me. Worth the wait to witness the attempt. I'm sure you'll agree that I'll be using the safety net of allowing you to put some questions I haven't had the wit or time to anticipate when I stop talking. And finally, I'll suggest a couple of next steps that you might take, and I argue ought to take, and you may even feel you want to take if you're convinced about the existence of the abyss and that there's something we can do about it. That's where I'll be trying to convince you actually to do what I've suggested in part 4. Imagine that, an academic lecture that might actually lead to things being different, worth considering. Don't you agree? And then finally, we'll have some time for questions and discussion, where, as I say, I'm hoping you'll either explain to me where I failed to convince you about the existence of the abyss between what Christianity requires in relation to the treatment of other animals and what we're currently doing, or about the wisdom of what I'm suggesting we do about it, or you ask for more detail about how you can get started on the practical action I'm proposing. What I'd really like you not to do is leave unconvinced without letting me know why, or at least discussing the reasons with your friends. You've already got the sense that the challenge I'm presenting is significantly to do with practical action. So I'm hoping you'll leave either convinced and resolved to act, or clear about why you're unconvinced. And I'm looking forward to getting a sense of which of those is the case. I've put a Twitter hashtag on Animals on Tour up on the screen for those of you who feel moved to share your responses to what you're hearing with each other and the world as we go along. I won't be following that conversation live, but we'll review it with interest. And if you tweet, you may help to take our reflections and their impacts beyond the confines of this room, which would be great. Or it may help to entertain you during the boring bits. Either way. Okay. Let's begin with the question then of why animals? Is animal ethics worth our time? As I've indicated, I'm aware that there are many other pressing issues beyond animal ethics that demand our attention, reflection, and action. White supremacy, the operations of individual and structural racism, its connection with debates about immigration, borders, and walls is unexpectedly, at least to me, a live question again. A wealthy world still struggles to feed the poor, with famine threatening in Yemen and sub-Saharan Africa, a situation that must be seen in connection with the obscene inequality revealed in the recent Oxfam report, showing that a mere 26 of the world's richest individuals globally own as much as half of the rest of the global population. Our triggering of catastrophic climate change, the first fruits of which are already imperiling the lives of vulnerable human and other than human creatures, and the shocking and bewildering lack of political leadership nationally and internationally capable of the policy responses required, threaten to make discussion of any other issue utterly irrelevant. No doubt other pressing issues come to your mind. How can I justify making time for Christian animal ethics in days like these? Well, I want to offer three defenses of Christian animal ethics in this context. First of all, urgency. Second, ethical multitasking. And third, intersectionality. So first, urgency. This is a representation of the relative proportion of domesticated animal biomass and wild land mammal biomass in 1900. When I first came across the statistics reported in a book by Václav Smil called Harvesting the Biosphere, I was really shocked. So by 1900, we had so far expanded our production of domesticated animals that their combined mass outweighed that of all wild land mammals by 3.5 times. So 3.5 times more domesticated animals in 1900 than all wild land mammals. In the intervening 100 years until the year 2000, this happened. We quadrupled the biomass of domesticated animals, and that was one of the key factors in halving the biomass of wild land mammals. And so by 2000, the combined biomass of domesticated animals was 24 times that of all wild land mammals. 24 times. Domesticated chickens alone represent nearly 3 times the biomass of all wild birds. And in the same 100 years, we reduced the numbers of fish in the oceans by 90%. Raising livestock in these numbers is a major contribution to an anthropogenic mass extinction event, comparable with those found in the geological record. And this was a key sort of moment of realization for me, that what we're doing to domesticated animals is one of the key problems in impacts on wild animals. If we continue on this trajectory, there will be virtually no wild animals to be concerned about. If we combine this with the realization of the cruelly impoverished lives imposed by us on farmed animals, the vast majority of which are raised in novel industrial environments, as I'll discuss in part 3, we can see that what we're doing to domesticated and wild animals demands our urgent attention on grounds of scale, intensity, and impact. Second, I suggest we should make time for animal ethics because we can multitask ethically. We don't have to choose between being alert to climate catastrophe and white supremacy. We can be alert to both. In recommending that we pay attention to animal ethics, I'm not suggesting that we abandon concern for everything else. The policy proposals I'll come to in part 4 will not demand the entirety of our attention or our time. We can pay attention and respond to more than one thing at once, so can include animal ethics as among our ethical concerns. Third, it turns out that we don't need to choose between concern for other animals, concern for human neighbours, and concern for the environment because they intersect. I'll discuss this more in part 5. These intersections means that challenging what we're doing to farmed animals has the potential to bring benefits for humans, wild animals, and the environment. To do well by humans, wild animals, and the environment, we have no choice but to attend to what we're doing in raising unprecedented numbers of livestock. Animal ethics is worth our time then, even in days like these. First, because of the scale, intensity, and impacts of our current practice makes it urgent. Second, because we can multitask and so don't need to choose between this and other issues. And third, because it turns out that what we're doing in using other animals for food has deep connections to wrongdoing towards other humans and the environment. And that's one example for me of the intersections in terms of what's going on in our practice. Some of the worst jobs to have in this country or any other at the moment are to work in these vast meat processing plants. And it turns out that the labor in those plants, jobs which are highly physically dangerous, very high injury rates, and mentally dangerous, lead to trauma and mental illness. The jobs are being disproportionately done by women, by Latinx people, by migrants, and by black people, so that the people that we're asking to do the nasty work of the nasty things that we're doing to farmed animals are themselves being exploited. So it's an example of this intersectionality at work. So second, why should other animals matter to Christians in particular? And I have in mind the importance of this part of what I'm trying to do, because Christians often understand themselves as have often understood themselves in that sort of singer-type mode. Animal ethics is an issue for other kinds of people. It's not the kinds of things that Christians are concerned about. So I'm interested in engaging with specifically Christian reasons for being concerned about animals, and in continuity with Christian activism on behalf of animals, which I think has been largely forgotten. So in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, it's Christians and one prominent vegan Jew called Louis Gompertz, who in Britain are lobbying for the first legislation against animal cruelty. Later in the 19th century, it's Christians, this time more of a bottom-up campaign, because the RSPCA that had been formed by that early movement got captured by political elites in the UK and wasn't interested in challenging the vivisection that was being done by scientific and medical establishment. So it was more of a popular working-class Christian movement that said, we know the strong shouldn't be exploiting the weak to expand their own knowledge, as these people are doing. And against Darwin and Huxley and other kind of key figures at the time, Christians were making anti-vivisection arguments in the late 19th century. So I'm interested in reconnecting with that kind of tradition. So my challenge in part 2 is to digest On Animals Volume 1 into about 10 minutes, which is another plug to buy, or at least read the book where I go into substantially more detail. As a taster, I'm going to follow the structure of Volume 1 with the aim of outlining the case that Christians have faith-based reasons for being concerned about animals. I warn you that we're about to get theological. So for those less interested in doctrine and who are prepared to go with what I'm arguing here, that Christians have faith-based reasons to care about animals, feel free to nod off and I'll wake you when we're on the other side. To the rest of you, strap in for some Christian doctrine. Chapter 1 of On Animals, Volume 1 asks what creation is for, and notes a number of Christian theologians who can be found saying that creation is all about us, that God made everything for the sake of human beings. I start with the first century Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria and trace argument and assertion made for this same position, drawing on Philo's work in Origen, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and later John Calvin, Francis Bacon, Karl Barth, and many other theologians, with a particular highlight for me being Henry Moore's 1653 statement that God only gave life to cattle and sheep to keep their meat fresh until we could eat them. In the face of this impressive list of authorities, I draw on arguments that to construe God's purposes anthropocentrically in this way is a grave theological mistake. I draw on a better moment in Karl Barth here to make the case for a theocentric, God-centered understanding of creation, alongside Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, the idea that creation has its goal in God, not in human beings. Before also noting the concern of the German theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg, among others, that God's purposes should not be interpreted as self-glorification, but as creating in order to be gracious to each creature as an end in themselves. I rest with the rejection that there are insufficient grounds to understand us human beings as the reason for God's creation of the universe in a Christian theological context, and good theological reasons to reject such a remarkable assertion of human self-importance. Building on that key foundation, I move on to Colin Gunton's observation that in Basil of Caesarea's work, so early Christian patristic theologian, Gunton points out that Basil came to the conclusion, by virtue of the belief that God is the creator of everything, against the assumptions of almost the whole of the ancient world, that there are no degrees of being. So in the context of an ancient world, which sort of structured hierarchically degrees of being from deity down to muck, Basil of Caesarea instead says that everything created has the same ontological status, the same fundamental status. So a fundamental feature of the Christian doctrine of creation is that we should recognize two kinds of things, God and creatures, and recognize ourselves as creature kind in solidarity with all of God's other creatures. This means rejecting the many theological accounts that try to position humans as midway between humans and between angels and animals, or as some necessary nexus between God and creation. So the idea that humans play some kind of pivotal mediating role. Instead, we need to recognize that we're made of dirt or stardust, just like all the rest of God's creatures, and our excitement about our own creaturely capacities should not tempt us to ignore or diminish the particular capacities of our fellow creatures. Humans are unique and have a unique vocation before God, called to image God to fellow creatures, but every other creature also has their own unique vocation. Ask the psalmist, who delights in God's ordering of our diverse world of creatures, each glorifying their Maker in their own particular place and mode of life, and celebrates the God who has compassion on every living thing. Psalms 104 and 145, for example. Therefore, I argue, creation is best understood as God's gracious bestowal of being on all creatures, both for their own sake and so that they may glorify God in their participation in the triune life of God. All creatures are declared good by their Creator in their own right. All creatures exist in utter dependence on God and mutual dependence on one another. No creature can be comprehended merely as the means to the flourishing of another. God's animal creatures have particular attributes in common. They are fleshy creatures with the breath of life, especially dependent on other organisms for their survival, often the common subjects of God's blessing and judgment, capable of response to God in a distinctive mode. Differences between animal creatures need to be understood in the context of this commonality, with attention given to the particular mode of life of each animal creature and similarities between groups of animals, vertebrates, mammals, primates, not neglected in the task of specifying the particularity of the human mode of being an animal creature. Christian theology, and in continuity with much wider patterns in Western thought, has tended to rest on this sort of human-animal binary. And one of my projects in that aspect of the work is to try and deconstruct that and point out where that's a very implausible division of creaturely things. I think many Christians might grant that a Christian doctrine of creation provides grounds for valuing the lives of other animals, but think that by the time we get to Christology, incarnation, and atonement, we're liable to lapse back into an anthropocentric view of Christian faith. Part 2 of On Animals, Volume 1, argues that to interpret the doctrine of reconciliation anthropocentrically is also a mistake. We rush to the assumption that God became human for the sake of saving humans from human sinfulness. But there are important reference points for a much wider perspective on the work of Christ within a Christian theological understanding. The prologue to John's Gospel summarizes the doctrine of the incarnation, not that the Word became human, but the Word became flesh. And flesh here is this messy bodily stuff common to humans and other animal creatures, in both the Hebrew term basar and the Greek term sarx. The famous verse, John 3:16, beloved of so many Christian sign makers, declares that God's motivation in sending his only son was to save not humans, but the world, the cosmos in Greek. The opening of the letter to the Ephesians in the New Testament declares that in Christ, God gathered up all things in heaven and on earth. And the opening of the letter to the Colossians pictures the Lord Jesus Christ as the firstborn of creation, in whom all things were made, reconciling all things in heaven and earth to God by making peace on the cross. I could say much more here, but in the context of these majestic visions of the cosmic scope of God's reconciling work in Jesus Christ, to think of the doctrine of the atonement or the incarnation as some kind of monospecies transaction between God and humanity seems to me a strangely blinkered underestimate of what Christians want to say God has done in Christ. And these two paintings are from a wonderful series by Stanley Spencer called Christ in the Wilderness. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is baptized and then goes into the wilderness, and Mark says to be with the wild animals. And Christians have often interpreted that as, it must be a really awful thing to be in the wilderness and with the wild animals. But there are readings which suggest instead we could see this as a kind of representation of an inbreaking messianic peace between humans and other animals. And so Jesus is with the wild animals at peace in the wilderness, rather than that being a site of conflict or danger for him. And as we move on to thinking about doctrine of redemption, here's another painting painted by the Quaker John Hicks, one of a series. He painted this image again and again, the Peaceable Kingdom. And you can see that this is an American context for thinking about redemption holistically. You can see that on the left side of the screen, he's picturing peace between colonial invaders and native peoples. And on the right-hand side, he's picturing peace between all kinds of fairly endearing-looking wild animals who are kind of newly living at peace with one another in this new creation. So in reaching this last major doctrinal heading of Volume 1, again, it may seem that everything is in danger of collapsing back into anthropocentrism. Christians have sometimes come to think of redemption as something like a teleporting of a select group of human souls out of their bodies in order to drift about with angels in a cloudy heaven. Christian thinking about redemption is much more diverse and often much more grounded in creaturely diversity along the lines of this painting. And Hicks is drawing on the words of the prophecy in Isaiah 11 of what it's going to look like when the Messiah comes. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In 1781, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, preached a sermon on Romans 8, 19-22, called The General Deliverance. You can find it online very easily. Wesley makes the case for God's care of animals by drawing on the Psalms and declares that God is merciful to animals in redeeming them from their suffering. Quote, "Nothing can be more express. Away with vulgar prejudices and let the plain word of God take place. They shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into glorious liberty, even a measure according as they are able of the liberty of the children of God." 3 years later, John Wesley published John Hildrop's book, Free Thoughts Upon the Brute Creation, which argued that all creatures that God had reason to create, God also has a reason to preserve and redeem, since any reason for their annihilation or extinction would be a reason that they should not have been created in the first place. These inclusive creaturely visions of redemption are in continuity with Christian patristic accounts in which Christ redeems the whole of creation, or all things are restored to their paradisical state. This wider creaturely vision of redemption is also reflected in the book of Revelation, the final book of the Christian New Testament, which pictures every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them singing praises to the Lamb, to God. Again, I could say much more here and do in Volume 1, Part 3, but making the Christian doctrine of redemption, again, a monospecies event with the myriad number of every other kind of creature merely discarded, seems deeply unattractive theologically in the context of these encompassing redemptive visions. Okay, for those of you sleeping through the doctrine, it's time to wake up. Let me just tell you one story. I wonder if you've heard the story of St. Macarius of Alexandria, an Egyptian hermit in the 4th century. The story goes that one day as Macarius was sitting in his cell, he heard a knocking at his door. Thinking that a monk had come to see him, he opened the door and was astonished to find that a hyena had been knocking at the door and with her head. She held her puppy in her mouth and offered the puppy to him, weeping. Macarius took the puppy in his hands and looked to see what was the matter. He saw that the puppy was blind in both eyes. He took the puppy, groaned, spat on the puppy's face and signed it on the eyes with his finger. Immediately the puppy could see, ran to his mother, suckled from her and followed her away. The next day the hyena returned and knocked on the hermit's door again. This time when he opened it, he saw that she had a sheepskin in her mouth. He asked her where she had got the sheepskin, if she had not eaten a sheep, and told her that he would not take the sheepskin if it had come of violence. The hyena struck her head on the ground, bent her paws, and prayed on her knees for him to take it. He said he would not take it unless she promised not to harm the poor by eating their sheep, and she nodded her head as if she were promising him. Then he told her that he would not take it unless she promised not to kill another creature. And said if she was hungry, she should come to him and he would give her bread. The hyena bent, nodded, and looked at him in the eye as if she were promising him. So Macarius offered praises to God for giving understanding to the animals and letting Macarius come to understand God's ways. He took the sheepskin from the hyena and she went away. From time to time, she would come to Macarius for food and he would give her bread. And he slept on the sheepskin until he died. The story is collected with many others in Helen Waddell's wonderful little book called Beasts and Saints. And there are other stories about a stag where St. Godric, who used to live nearby where I used to live in Durham in England, was a sort of proto-hunt saboteur in sort of saving a stag from the Prince Bishop's hunt. And then these stories seem to follow me around. So in Chester now, where I am, there's a story of St. Werburgh, patron saint of Chester, whose steward was trying to protect her cornfields from the geese and took the geese into her a barn. And overnight, her steward stole one of the geese, killed the goose, and ate the goose. Next morning, the geese all come to protest to St. Werburgh about that one of them's missing before they go off. And she comes out, demands what's happened, asks the steward to give her the bones of the goose. And she holds the bones, and in her hands, as she's holding the bones, the flesh grows back on the bones, the feathers grow back on the flesh, and the goose is sort of released, hops about a bit, and then sort of takes off, and they all circle together to sort of to give thanks for their deliverance. Now, we smile at these stories, but I don't think we should only smile at them, because to me it seems that they present the insight treasured by those who pass these stories on of what that it belongs to Christian holiness to take compassion on other animals. So for me, these stories of the saints are ways in which these traditions, biblical traditions of concern for animals, are taken into a world more like our own. So I've argued in this part 2 that Christians have strong doctrinal reasons for recognizing the place of other animals in God's purposes alongside human beings, and that their participation in God's work of creation, reconciliation and redemption provides strong grounds for Christians to be concerned about their particular lives of creaturely flourishing, in which each in their particular creaturely way, like us, they glorify their Creator. Through this and the ways this understanding is mediated in the stories of the saints, I'm hoping I've convinced you that Christians do have strong faith-based reasons for being concerned about animals, which is the first step in demonstrating the existence of this abyss between the kind of treatment a Christian understanding of other animals requires and what we're currently doing. So part 3, what are we doing to other animals? As I noted earlier, On Animals Volume 2 discusses how we make use of other animals in a whole variety of ways. For food, textiles, labour, research experimentation, sport and entertainment, as pets and companions, and our impacts on wild animals. But as I've said, the scale, intensity and impact of our use of other animals for food makes all other animal uses almost seem irrelevant, at least numerically. And our use for food a priority concern. So that's what I'm focusing on this part 3, though I'm happy to discuss some of those other uses as we have time in questions. I feel the need to issue another content advisory at this point. If part 2 of this talk was demanding in its delving into Christian doctrine, the challenge of this part is confronting the deeply uncomfortable truths of the lives and deaths we're currently inflicting on other animals. So in Volume 2, Chapter 2, I argue that using other animals for food inflicts very significant harm and suffering on them and provides very little opportunity for them in most contexts to flourish in their complex social patterns of life or make use of their sophisticated cognitive capacities. Farmed animals have their lives and bodies entirely reshaped in intensive industrial agriculture to make them more efficient units of human production, usually to their very great cost. Remarkably, 98 to 99% of animals killed for human food are fish. The expansion of fishing and adoption of industrial methods have resulted, as I've said, in a reduction of wild fish stocks by about 90% between 1900 and 2000. Fish, getting increasingly good evidence about the capacity of fish to experience pain and suffering. And wild-caught fish suffer for a long period in the capture process, both before they're pulled out of the water and afterwards. And fishing causes substantial collateral damage for non-target species and the marine environment. Another of the images I have in mind, perhaps to include in this presentation, is an amazing satellite image of industrial trawling. And it almost looks like a sort of flock of birds in the sea, where you've got these big industrial trawlers that are towing these huge nets which are scraping along the bottom of the sea and are sometimes up to 100 miles wide, and are basically clear-cutting the oceans, taking absolutely everything with them and doing significant destruction even to the ocean bed. About half of fish now derive from intensive fish farms, which raise fish in close confinement and feed them with, on average, twice as much wild fish as we get from the farmed fish, which exacerbates pressure on wild fish populations. So really obviously problematic misuse of resources in this growth industry of fish farming. After fish, chicken are used in the biggest numbers, with 66 billion killed for food in 2016 and a further 8 billion used for eggs. The vast majority of chickens are raised intensively in broiler sheds or battery cages, bred to maximize their productivity so that broiler hens reach slaughter weight in only 5 weeks, suffering pain from legs forced to support prematurely heavy bodies. Male chicks from laying breeds in all commercial systems of egg production are surplus to requirements. So they're killed as soon as they're sexed, about a day after hatching. In the EU, one of the permitted humane methods is just for them to be put on a conveyor belt and fall live into a grinding machine. Elsewhere in the world, they're just sort of tied up in bin bags and left to suffocate. And that represents about 4 billion male chicks annually. Ducks are the next most numerous animal killed for food after chickens, with 3 billion killed annually, most of which are raised intensively in similar conditions to chickens. Pigs are the next most intensively reared animal, with 1.5 billion killed in 2016, most of whom live in bare indoor sheds like this one, with very little opportunity for the expression of species-specific behaviours. As part of a project I'm working on in the UK at the moment, I got to visit an intensive pig farm for the first time in December. It's quite hard to get into intensive pig farms because they look as nasty as that. And I was deeply upset by what I witnessed there, even after researching this for 10 years. pigs that were in a stall barely able to all stand up at the same time. They'd had their tails docked, but they were still chewing each other's tail stumps. And EU regulations now require some kind of enrichment, but that was being delivered merely by a block of wood about this size on a chain at one side of the stall, in the stall of about 20 pigs. So maybe one at a time they could chew on the wood instead of chewing on each other. It's a really, really disturbing scene. Nearly 1 billion, and UK farmed animal welfare is generally thought to be significantly higher than US farmed animal welfare. Nearly 1 billion rabbits are killed each year for food, most of whom are raised in small cages. Most sheep and goats are raised extensively, but moves to intensive indoor production are becoming more common, especially for dairy products. Lambs are killed at only a few months of age. And sheep with other livestock are often subjected to the great stress of live export and long journeys by sea and road. I was really shocked when I found that sheep are exported from Australia, being kept on the decks of these large cargo ships taken to the Middle East for slaughter, and so experience really significant temperature rises and falls on the decks of these ships in numbers of tens of thousands. Increasingly intensive methods are being used to raise cattle, with animals confined to bare feedlots for finishing before slaughter. Growing numbers of dairy cows are kept inside without access to grazing. That's an image from an intensive dairy farm I visited on the same few days in December. So these are cows that never get to go outside, never get to graze grass, which is becoming increasingly common. Virtually all dairy cows have their calves taken from them at birth or shortly afterwards. The calves from these cows never even met their mothers because they were so worried about the possibility of the infection of Jonas disease from mother to calf. And so these cows are kept almost perpetually pregnant, but never get to meet the calves that they give birth to. I've had some really good student work being done on sort of feminist analysis of the ethics of the dairy industry. And then a lot of people are unaware that as soon as productivity declines or cows are unable to become pregnant again, they're slaughtered for beef. So a third of beef, I don't know the figures in the US, but a third of beef in the UK comes from culled dairy cattle. And that's usually after about 3 or 4 lactations on average. The task I set myself in this part of the lecture was to convince you that there's an abyss between the kind of treatment a Christian understanding of animals requires, think of St. Macarius and the hyena's pup, and what we're currently doing to animals in these farmed systems. And that final image is about deforestation. So lots of people are aware things like palm oil coming from unsustainable sources are really problematic for deforestation. But the thing we need to be even more concerned about on a much bigger scale is deforestation in order to either graze livestock or grow crops for livestock. So deforestation to grow soy to feed to livestock is a much, much bigger cause of deforestation and therefore environmental damage than just palm oil. Not that I'm trying to say we shouldn't be concerned about palm oil too. So I'll await your response as to whether or not you're convinced, but it seems to me beyond question that subjecting fellow animal creatures to these lives and these deaths merely to satisfy our preference for cheap access to products derived from them is blatantly unnecessary cruelty at deep odds with Christian faith commitments. So that's the abyss I'm seeking to convince you of. Here is a farmer called Frank Rees. And he's one of the farmers discussed in a book by Jonathan Safran Foer called Eating Animals. Frank Rees is trying to raise turkeys in ways similar to they would have been raised in the late 19th century. So trying to go back to heritage breeds before we turned raising of turkeys, like other poultry, into this intensive production. And I strongly recommend, if you get the chance to see it, to have a look at a brilliant documentary film made of the book. So the documentary is called Eating Animals, narrated by Natalie Portman, and really engages empathetically with his sense of what it would mean to do well by the birds in his care and how strongly that contrasts with other ways of raising turkeys. So What should we do differently? If we're convinced that there's this major problem with how we're raising animals, farmed animals for food at the moment, what should we do differently? And I want to suggest that there are many issues where it seems like it would be really hard for us to have any significant impact. So I'm sure you were exercised by the government shutdown over New Year, but probably feeling pretty impotent in terms of action you could take to try and resolve that political impasse. I'm sure you have sympathy for me as a British citizen, utterly appalled at the prospect of Britain about to crash out of the European Union, but not having much sense about how I could contribute to a successful resolution of Brexit negotiations. I want to suggest that while this issue about what we're doing to farmed animals is also huge and systemic, there are also very simple things which seem very obviously to be important and impactful practical responses that we can make. And that's what I want to suggest just briefly in this fourth part. So first of all, it's abundantly obvious that we just need to reduce overall consumption of animal products. It's really clear. No significant increases in animal welfare can be affected while we're eating the numbers of animals that we're currently eating. And also, eating the animals we're currently eating is directly related to problems of human food security, human water security, and climate change. So at the moment, we're feeding more than a third of global cereal output to livestock. And the feed conversion ratio, if you compare the calories and nutrition we would get if we ate the cereals compared to the calories and nutrition we get by eating the animals, the efficiency is about 8%. So we're basically throwing 92% of that third of global cereal output away. And so even if you're only concerned for human food security, you ought to be very concerned about that. Similarly, in relation to water security, it takes between about 10 and 20 times as much water to produce same levels of nutrition through animal means compared to plant-based options. So, and then in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, this is beginning to get on the map very, very belatedly. But global emissions from livestock represent, depending how you estimate it, maybe 18% or up to 51% of all global carbon emissions. And so it's much bigger than transport globally, but gets much less attention and seems to me much more potentially malleable in terms of changes in practice. So reducing consumption looks to be an obvious practical response in relation to this question, and it's something that obviously, given that we're all engaged with this practice of eating and know people that also eat, this is something directly under our control and control of our communities and the institutions to which we belong. And second, we need to move to higher welfare sourcing. So we need to reduce overall consumption, and then for the animal products that are still being consumed, and I'm not imagining a very quick transition to a completely vegan utopia, we need to improve the welfare of the animals that are being used. And so that's the two key policy responses that are my clear conclusions from this analysis. It seem to me really hard to dispute. But isn't it more complicated than that? I need to draw things to a close in order to allow some time for conversation, but I just want to present you with this image, which seems to me to focus a great deal of the complexities of what's going on. So it comes from North Carolina during Hurricane Florence in last September. And this is a flooded hog farm in North Carolina. So in North Carolina, there are about as many pigs as there are people. And these massive intensive pig farms are located in the state. And it's one example of environmental racism in terms of where these pig plants are placed. So much more likely to get planning permission for these pig farms proximate to black and native populations in North Carolina. And living next to an intensive pig farm is about the worst thing you can possibly imagine. The amount of excrement produced by these thousands of pigs goes into big lagoons, and then they empty the lagoons by spraying the pig shit into the air in neighbouring fields. And so people who live near to these things say you literally get shit on. And people have their kids send their kids to school who are teased because they smell of pig shit. So this is really, really obviously appalling thing to do to the pigs and an appalling thing to do to the people who are forced to live near the pigs. And just last year, the state government in Raleigh passed new legislation to restrict the amount of compensation and restrict the grounds for complaint you could make against these facilities. So the political power is behind the pig farmers. And the people who are protesting about the siting of the pig farms are called N-word loving because of the association between the problematic impacts of the pigs and black and native populations. So that for me is a very focal image of how what we're doing that's terrible to the pigs is terrible environmentally. And obviously when this kind of flooding takes place, there's local problems. And the intensity of climate events like Hurricane Florence is being precipitated by the climate change, which is being facilitated by this global animal agriculture. So that, for me, is a very important way of characterizing intersections between our concerns for human beings, for animals, and for the environment. Okay, I'm winding up in order to give us time for questions. The thing we're trying to do through this Creature Kind project is to seek, especially in Christian context, but we're happy to work with other organizations too, to encourage a corporate response to this challenge. So we're having a conversation at Harvard Divinity School this morning, thinking how could Harvard Divinity School begin to respond to the question about what it would mean to connect faith and food policy. And so we're hoping to get people to think about this corporately, in order to say the kind of food that we provide together, the kind of food that our institutions provide, how could we work on ways to reduce overall consumption and move to higher welfare sourcing? Harvard Business School has just signed up to the leadership circle of a program called Farm Forward to get really good help on reducing overall consumption and moving to higher welfare sourcing. Be great if the law school wanted to do something similar.
I think they're the trial. They're trying it out there first before they move it to the other schools.
But in this or any other institutions that you are part of, if you want resourcing and help for thinking about how you could begin to engage with responses that might begin to affect these changes towards reduced consumption and higher welfare sourcing, please get in touch. We'd be really glad to hear from you. There's a sign-up sheet going around if you want to follow what Creature Kind's doing. So I started with this image of an abyss. I argued that animal ethics is worth our time, that the Christians have serious faith-based reasons for being concerned about animals, that what we're doing to other animals in part 3 is seriously at odds with those commitments, that there are these policies of reducing consumption and moving to higher welfare sourcing are obviously desirable changes which are within our reach, that these issues are complex and intersectional, and we can discuss some of those complexities, but that doesn't diminish the importance of these simple practical actions that we can make. And fourthly, that encourage to practical action. If you're convinced about any of this, we'd really appreciate your help to help engage the institutions that you're part of and have influence within in making these kind of changes. So I'm going to shut up now in order to give us some time for conversation. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward very much to your questions and our conversation.
For anybody who has class at 1, we'll give you a moment to leave, and then we'll stick around. David will stick around to answer any questions you might have. And if you could put your hands up for the questions and wait for me to come around with a microphone because we are recording this. Thank you.
Thank you. Within the Christian ethical framework that you put forward, is there space for killing animals for the purpose of food, assuming those higher welfare standards are met, or is that something that's always out as fellow creatures?
Thank you. So I do talk about sort of the relationship between Christianity and veganism, and I think there are strong reasons. I just posted a blog on the Vegan Society website in the UK about should Christians be vegan. And I think there are important reasons to kind of push in that direction. But I'm quite keen not to be having a lot of time talking about whether if we abolished all of industrial animal agriculture, it'd be sort of slightly preferable to kill or not kill animals that were being given really good lives. And I mean, the reason why I'm slightly reluctant to enter that engagement is because I would really like to direct everyone's attention to this sort of macro problem rather than what seems to me the smaller problem about whether or not these 1 or 2% of global animals who are being raised in ways that could be construed as giving them a good life, whether that's ethically acceptable. At the moment in the UK, veganism is getting more and more popular, and that's leading to some critiques of veganism from high welfare farmers. So vegans have a go at the high welfare farmers have a go at the vegans, and I think we ought to be making common cause against the sort of industrialized animal agriculture, which is the macro problem that's confronting us all. So I'm vegan. I think there are good grounds for doing that, but I would really prefer to be valuing the Frank Reeses of this world who are doing as good a job as they can do in relation to the animals in their care. You know, I've got a friend who's raising a rare breed beef herd a couple of miles from where I live, and I really appreciate the sort of concern for the animals that he shows. And so at the moment, I would much rather be spending time on coalition building between people who are trying to do well by farmed animals and people who are trying to reduce consumption by various methods, rather than agonizing about whether or not it would be preferable not to raise animals at all.
Hi, I'm a Christian campus minister here, and I promise not all your questions are going to come from Kiwis. Are you a Kiwi? Oh, Australia. Okay. I think it's like really interesting, like this topic of the role of animals in Christian theology is really interesting and often not touched. And and I'm curious of some elements which I'm sure you've heard and you probably address in your book. But one, I guess my question is, as you were talking before about the role of animals in creation and humans in creation, and it's theocentric, I think that's very much true. My question is there any place where humans have like a special uniqueness? And so I think, there's some statements in that Genesis story about like human special role as kind of a special image bearer of God and a special leadership role, and people have misunderstood that and said that in different ways, in many ways. So I'm trying to get a sense of whether you're saying that all animals are special and humans are special and other things are special too, but not in a especially unique, special way, or if you are saying that, humans do have a special, unique place in creation, but it's not all about humans. Mm-hmm. Do you get the distinction?
Yep. So thank you for that. For some reason, it seems to me that Christians, like other people, are really concerned about this status question. Where do we find ourselves in relation to others, and that sort of on a trans-species basis or even an intrahuman basis, obviously at key points. For me, sort of reading Genesis 1 and the teaching there that human beings are uniquely made in God's image and given dominion in relation to other creatures, for me, as I sort of mentioned very briefly, that feels to me like responsibility rather than badge of status. So for me, I want to read that as a really high responsibility. It looks like we're the kinds of creatures that might have the power, and God knows we're exercising that power in problematic modes at the moment, to have some kind of impact on the lives of other animals. And we're given, if we interpret that imaging of God as a task rather than a badge of status, that responsibility is a very high one. How could we behave towards other creatures in ways that image the God that we worship? And so I'm absolutely up for talking about a high human calling to be imaging God to the rest of creation. And that feels to me like a unique human vocation that we're given, exercising our capacities to the full in relation to that key task. And what seems to me really appalling about our neglect of what we're doing to other animals at the moment is it seems to me we're not imaging any kind of Christian God in our practice. We're imaging Satan. I mean, it seems to me that the image we're giving is satanic, of a sort of exploitation of other creatures without any regard for their goodness and their being and their flourishing and their capacity to glorify God, and just using them as mere raw material for our ends. So I'm really happy for us to be focused on the uniqueness of a human calling before God and the responsibility that means, but I sometimes get perplexed about why we're so concerned to establish our relative importance in relation to God's other creatures. It seems to me, in an intrahuman context, it's clearly not a good idea for me to be over preoccupied with my status in relation to other human beings. And it seems to me, theologically, we seem to have got trapped into wanting to use Christian theology to prop up our sense of human self-importance. And it's not that I'm trying to say that there's any kind of, I'm not trying to do a Peter Singer of saying all animals are equal. I think we've got very good reasons for being profoundly concerned about human neighbours in relation to this wider complex. But I think we have got slightly preoccupied with our sense of sort of species self-importance. And without diminishing the ways in which God is gracious to humans, I think God has abundant grace and can be, and we need to be attentive to that wider question of our unique responsibilities rather than our unique status. By the way, I'm just going to put up a slide. It would be if you have a moment, literally about 1 minute, to respond to a few questions of feedback. We'd be really grateful. You can scan that QR code or go to that URL. It's just a very, very brief questionnaire. It would be helpful if you have a response. Yes, please.
Thank you for the lecture. I almost convinced.
Great.
I have two questions.
Yep.
One is food eating is inevitably connected with death. If we eat, we do not eat and we die, and if we eat and other creatures will die, whether it's plant or animal. Mm-hmm. So my question is, treating plants as food is okay, and there is any fundamental difference between animal and plant? That is my first question. Mm-hmm. And my second one is, how can we understand some passages in New Testament in which Jesus seemed to have presupposition that human being is more valuable than other creatures, like in Matthew, Lord feed birds, but you are more valuable than the birds. So how can you understand that passage?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of directing our attention to animals, I think this is just sort of one stage in terms of thinking about our relationships to sort of the wider creaturely world. And so, I think there are good grounds theologically and more generally for sometimes being focused on human animals. And then I think if we widen our circle of concern, it makes sense to attend to the commonalities that we share with the kinds of creatures that are most like us. And so, maybe that's primates in the first instance, and mammals, and then vertebrates, and then wider spheres of interest in attending to the kinds of creatures which are most like us. And then there's a very sort of fuzzy sphere or fuzzy circle when we sort of get out to animals, and there are problematic boundary cases like slime molds. It's not quite clear whether we should classify them as plants or animals. I don't have much at stake in a sort of in establishing that boundary. All I'm trying to say is that there's a kind of bunch of creatures which are quite like us in relevant ways, and so therefore merit a certain kind of particular moral attention. But I think you draw attention to something that's quite profound in relation to what I see a Christian engagement of these questions looks like, which is, it was really struck when I was beginning to think about what it means theologically to think about animals, to come across the biological characteristic that what characterizes an animal creature like us is that we can't make all the proteins that we need within our own bodies through inorganic means. And so we need to consume other living things in order to get by. Which makes all animals kind of seem like vampiric in some sense, it seems to me. But for me, theologically, that's interesting because it shows our dependence on other living things, but also shows that we're not finally going to get to be living at peace with all of the rest of creation in the world as we find it. And for me, as a Christian theologian, the doctrine of the fall means that we're not going to eat our way to some sort of moral utopia, whatever we do. And so we're living within this sort of fractured world in which our relationships with other creatures are always broken. And all we're trying to do is find the most responsible way of getting from here till tomorrow and the day after and the day after. So I'm not offering any kind of absolutist vision of here's how we can live in moral purity. I think it's better to be eating lentils than cows for a whole variety of reasons, including what life is like for a cow compared to a lentil. But so I think there are degrees here. But I agree with you that we're always going to be enmeshed in problematic relationships to other creaturely life, and so we just need to be making the most responsible decisions within this kind of in-between times that we can. And so I absolutely take your question, but I think eating plants rather than animals for a whole variety of reasons looks like a better and more responsible and a more peaceable way of living. So that's the animals and plant stuff. Sorry, just remind me the second point was, Jesus and, yes. So the teaching of Jesus, I think, is really interesting on this point. So Jesus, says things like, look, you know that not a single sparrow falls apart from your Father. Or in Luke's Gospel, not a single sparrow is forgotten by God. But reassure, don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows. And as you say, there are other sort of parallel things. What really strikes me there is that Jesus he's not trying to make the case that God cares for sparrows. He's appealing to an audience who already know that God cares even for a single sparrow. And so we're sort of working within that kind of framework, which is, echoes Psalm 145. God is compassionate, satisfies the desires of every living thing. So Jesus' audiences knew that, and he was using that teaching to reassure them that God would care for them too. And so I'm not trying to say we ought to be as concerned about a sparrow as a human neighbor. And so for me, it's not an embarrassment to hear Jesus say, look, you're even more valuable than a sparrow. Be reassured. You're secure in God's regard for you. I'm not trying to flatten everything out. But I am attentive to the way in which we've rushed to the conclusion without paying attention to the premise in Jesus' argument there. Because if we all accepted the premise that the life of even a tiny sparrow is of profound importance to God and therefore should be for us, we just couldn't operate the practices that we currently have in relation to farmed animal agriculture. I'm not saying we need to respect every sparrow or every chicken or every pig as if they were just the same as a human being. But if we give them just their due value, that Jesus is affirming, I think that is a radical transformation of our practice in relation to other animals.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. So you mentioned the Harvard Divinity School. So I just want to say, because I'm from Harvard Divinity School, I'm a faculty there and also the academic dean. And I just want to say that for one thing, I'm very, very sorry and embarrassed that I failed to put up a poster about this talk at the Divinity School. You would have gotten lots of people from the Divinity School. I just want to say, from the perspective of the study of religion as an academic field, that was just a fantastic talk. That was an amazing theological performance, and it just is so inspiring. And there were so many different things that you mentioned that I would love to talk about. But just I was trying to take notes, but that was just fantastic. Bravo. I mean, you talked about so many things, but your whole way, you are constructively trying to reimagine what do we want our notion of a Christian holy life to be? What are the features? What do we want to be as holy people? That's what you're doing. It's just bravo, and you're doing this beautiful job. So just thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
And do talk to Janet if you're interested in collaborating on helping the Divinity School to think through these issues in a practical way.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. So, yes, I agree. Thank you for this talk. It seems so important to me to sort of to be putting out this kind of narrative, because I think I'm not Christian, but I do think that religion has this really major role in creating the narratives by which we live. And so my question to you is, this narrative that you're giving us today, which is non-hierarchical and sort of puts aside this very common view of this chain of being type where all the creatures were made for human beings. This narrative that you're putting forward today, is there a history of that has been sort of obscured from us, or is this a new vision of what, our place in relation to other creatures are, and are there examples of that, or is this, so is this a new thing, or is it, has this vision been running alongside parallel but just obscured or suppressed? And can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, obviously, the Christian tradition, like any other religious tradition, is highly internally complex and has all kinds of interesting strands and trajectories within it. So, early Christian theology, I pointed to this moment that Basil Caesarea, he seems to have been reading Aristotle's works on animals, or at least some version of them. And he has this wonderful series of sermons called the Hexameron, where it's really endearing to read because he gets so excited about all these different kinds of creatures that he's kind of reading about and puts them all into his sermons, and then within the text apologizes for his audience for going on and on and on for much too long and keeping them from their work and so on. But he's really excited. And what Colin Gunton is pointing out, that he's just ditching this Platonic sort of hierarchy of being, and instead affirming, creaturely status is this sort of fundamental thing that we need to realize. But other Christian theologians are really going with Platonic and Neoplatonic orderings of creatures, and really going with Greek ideas that, so Christians made common cause with Stoic ideas that human beings were uniquely valuable within the cosmos because they had this rationality that they shared with God, and therefore had this unique status among all the other animals. And Christian theologians received that idea about unique human rationality and sort of translated it into then rational souls and eternal souls. And so you've got plural things going on with different pieces of reception that kind of fit with different parts of scriptural and theological thinking. And so as it seems to me, the task of being a Christian theologian or a Christian generally is to work out what it means to receive that highly complex, internally complex tradition and traditions of reflecting on texts in our day and in our time. And it seems to me that whatever was going on in relation to the original text, the situation of humans and other animals when Old Testament texts were being written, or when New Testament texts were written, is vastly different from that of our own. And so I think Genesis 1 is being written in an exilic context where the people are in exile. They're very confused about whether or not what their place is in God's purposes. They're sort of threatened on every side by humans and wild animals, and they're being given reassurance that you have a part in God's purposes. But our context of reading those contexts in which that dominion is sort of everywhere present as a kind of a monopolization of the earth's resources means I think we need to be reading the text in a way that's attentive to our new context. When the biomass distribution of domesticated and wild is so vastly different from when those texts were written. And so it seems to me that my task is to be receptive of that sort of broad tradition and then be telling the story in a way that's going to enable what's most profoundly important about those traditions to be heard in our time. And that's it's partly a constructive and a creative task as well as an interpretive one. And then Christians need to be arguing about who's telling the best stories about what our faith means for days like these. And that's the conversation that I hope to continue to have with fellow Christians.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for this really, inspiring and useful talk on a very pragmatic level. It's a great foundation to kind of be drawing on and pointing to your work as, you know, support for everything that probably many of us want to do. My question is maybe slightly academic, but actually, to be honest, it's much more just personal. I think it's not hard to have compassion for animals, but it's when I see and kind of open myself up to the great horror of the killing of animals, it's a lot harder to have compassion for other human beings. And what happens to me is I don't want the animals to be killed, but sometimes I kind of have the urge to like kill every other human on the planet. So what do you do with the self-hatred and the hatred for us as a species? I don't want to turn the conversation to another kind of, yet again, anthropocentric focus, but I'm just wondering, even as a theologian, how, you know, it's obviously problematic to be opening oneself to these levels of self-hatred, and how do we have compassion for other humans as, you know, perpetrators of this systemic genocide on such a scale? How do we be human in this kind of horrible situation that we've created for ourselves?
Yeah, and I don't underestimate that, and I have conversations with sort of advocates for animals and sort of activists in relation to climate change, where just the temptation to despair is really heavy. When I go to visit these sites, farmed animal sites of intensive animal agriculture, I find it, you know, I feel like I need to be there to be able to be a witness to what is taking place, but I find it deeply costly. And out of that, I sort of bring a sort of deep sadness and anger for the sort of mass scale of the suffering that we're sort of currently inflicting. But then I need to find a way to engage with it. And so, I mean, in a Christian context, it seems to me it shouldn't be any surprise to find that when human beings are given power over other kinds of beings and have the opportunities to exploit other humans and non-humans for their own ends, that they'll be tempted to do that. And it seems to me that it may be helpful either rhetorically, strategically, or maybe even a statement of some kind of truth, that most consumers have not had a whole lot of opportunity for engaging seriously with the realities of what is currently taking place. So industries had good reasons for trying to be as quiet as possible about the radical transformations in animal agriculture that have taken place since the Second World War. And consumers have inevitably seen an interest in buying food more cheaply, and have not been in the main very preoccupied with really trying to find out what's going on in terms of to enable the cheapness of the animal products that are now available. And so I tend to narrate it as trying to ask people to wake up to having sleepwalked into complicity with systems that are entirely sort of beyond that are radically novel, and very obviously problematic. So still, most audiences, even quite well-educated audiences that I speak to, are unaware that commercial egg production requires the killing of all the male chicks. So, and it's obviously the egg industry has not been championing that in sort of adverts and so on. And there's some moves by egg producers to do in-egg sexing now, so that you just destroy the eggs at an earlier point in development. But from some Christian perspectives, that only looks like a modest improvement. But it seems to me that most people have just not been confronted with the scandal of what is now being done to animals. And so what I try to be is patient with other people who have not had the chance to be engaging with that before. And what it seems to me is the task of trying to encourage people to have the moral imagination to make connections between the sort of shrink-wrapped piece of flesh on the supermarket shelf, or the burger on their plates, and the sort of networks of animal lives that are necessary to bring that product into being. But we generally don't have very good moral imaginations about human issues either. The clothes that we're wearing, and all. So I want to be patient. I'm aware that I mess up, and I'm sure fellow Christians are impatient with me about all kinds of elements of my practice. And so I want to be trying to be patiently engaging with other Christians in this way. And I think it is a particular issue because I do meet lots of angry vegan Christians who sort of find it hard to talk and be in church communities because of their sense of anger. And I appreciate their position, but if we're going to have productive conversations, I think we just need to be recognized that we're all failing to recognize significant moral responsibilities, and just our task is to, as gently and clearly as we can, help other people to see the things we do and then listen to them about the things they see better.
Thank you very much for your work, your talk, and for providing me belatedly with a response to my very religious sister. I was at her house a while ago, and she had set mouse traps. And suddenly, this tiny creature was screaming. And I was frantic. And she was very serene and said, "We shall have dominion." And now I could say, but that means responsibility. And I hope that you don't think this is frivolous, because we talked about the cruelty to animals for food, but we are divorced from that. We don't see it. Whereas with, now I do feel silly, but with the little mouse, I'm right there listening to it suffer.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you might respond to that, because actually we have an epidemic now of rodents, mice and rats. Is this frivolous?
No, I don't think it's frivolous at all. And I think what the question that confronts us when we are directly engaged with other animals in that kinds of way is instructive for us. I mean, it seems to me that those people who want to sort of respond to say, well, we don't need to be concerned about the screaming of the mouse, have done some very significant work in sort of categorizing the kind of creatures that count morally and the kind of creatures that don't. And it seems to me really clear that to use the sort of Genesis 1 language of dominion, and having neglected this relationship to being the image of God, in the same verse and the neighbouring verses, seems to be a very selective retrieval. And I think often the Christian tradition has been raided for convenient texts to justify the kind of practice towards other animals that is very convenient for us. And we need to watch for where there's just sort of bad readings of Scripture. But I think we need to recognise that, say in relation to mice or rats, or all kinds of other engagements, we sometimes will find ourselves in sort of conflicts of various kinds with various kinds of non-animal creatures. So I have ants that sort of want to come into my house that would make my house quite an uncomfortable place to live in. So I might aspire to some sort of radical hospitality where I just sort of allow them to crawl over all my food, but I don't. And instead I try and adopt the sort of least least problematic ways of engaging. So I try to block holes rather than poison them. And so I think we're sort of engaged with this sort of mess, and brokenness, and we're never going to be able to get our relationships sort of fully right. But we might be able to find ways of working with the mice in our homes that didn't require their deaths. And I would be encouraging sort of creative thinking about that. But I think we need to recognise that there's none of this where we're going to reach this sort of utopia. We're living in a broken relationship, and Christians would hope for the transformation and the sort of radical realisation of a reign of God finally, where it allows a full peace between other creatures. But here and now, we just need to be seeking to find ways of working which are kind of least damaging and destructive to these fellow creatures.
Thank you so much for this talk. I have a theological question.
Great.
So it seems like you took kind of a systematic approach, and I'm wondering if people have done work looking at animals from a liberation theology perspective, and if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so there's this theologian called Andrew Lindsay who characterises his theological work, which began in the 1970s, as a sort of liberation theology of animals. I'm not sure that it would be recognised very clearly by liberation theologians as operating sort of clearly within those traditions. You know, if I would be wanting to be, if I was wanting to sort of think in that direction, which seems interesting to me, I'd be wanting to emphasise solidarity across human and non-human and environmental issues. So Leonardo Boff has this wonderful book, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, and has done a lot of work on sort of intersectionality between animals, the environment, and human well-being, which was very influential on Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical in 2015. And Laudato Si is just a remarkable engagement, I think, which again looks very constructive at that liberation theology, environmental ethics, and animals interface, where it talks about sort of our mother and our sister Earth, interestingly plural, gendered imagery. Our mother and our sister Earth is sort of crying out in pain at what we're currently doing to her, and draws on Franciscan spiritualities in terms of God's regard for every living thing and so on. So I think there's lots of productive work to do at that boundary. But a lot of the Catholic discussion of Laudato Si hasn't gone in the direction of animals, and I think there's much more work to be done to put animals into that conversation. So I think we've got kind of liberation theology and environment quite well done, but I think we've been missing out an animals section, which seems quite important. And if you look at the sort of broiler sheds that I've been to, or the pigs in the sty, and think about what might constitute their liberation, I think there's plenty to go at. But it needs more exploration.
So you wanted to know, if we were convinced, well, I came here convinced that animal agriculture was an incredible sore on our culture. Mm-hmm. I used to believe that the 21st century, for the 21st century, animal liberation would be the social movement. Now I'm not sure we'll survive the 21st century, so I'm hedging my bets. Uh-huh. But I'm a Singerian atheist. But I found your theological arguments both pertinent and moving, very moving. I do have a question from the perspective of your theology. Yep. Where does predation fit in? I'm talking about predation on the part of non-human animals toward one another. Yep. And in generally speaking, can we construe some kind of responsibility that certain animals, maybe certain species of animals, have toward us in the context of what their value is? And
sorry, let's just say that last bit again.
Yeah, whether we can understand animals as having responsibilities toward other animals and toward us. That's a big discussion in standing in court, for example.
Thank you. Yep. So, I'm sorry, jet lag is kicking in. Let me do the second bit first, and then I'll ask you to remind me what the first part was. So the second part, do animals have responsibilities towards us? I'm quite keen, while I wouldn't want to be marching around telling animals off for the way they're behaving, I am quite keen that we need to think across the human-non-human boundary in relation to moral capacity. Because I think that's one of the ways in which we've sort of tried to hold in place a human, non-human animal binary, which in a really implausible way. So it's really, really good evidence that all kinds of animals have particular cultures in which particular kinds of behavior is accepted and other kinds of behavior is not accepted, got senses of justice and so on. So it's really clear that within non-human animal populations, there is a sense that it's continuous. It's not the same, but it's continuous with some of our senses about what counts as fair treatment and so on. And so therefore, I think it's not completely implausible to think about certain kinds of expectations within non-human communities about how members of those communities behave. And then really, I don't know about obligation, but really interesting examples of trans-species protection and collaboration, of dolphins saving humans from sharks, and all kinds of ways in which interspecies sympathy seems manifest in the non-human world. So we could, there's a lot there, but I certainly don't. I don't think moral capacity stops at the human boundary. Predation. This is really, really important. So that Christians are heir to texts which are impatient with this kind of broken, fallen life in which creatures are not living peaceably with one another. And so Genesis 1, I think we can interpret as, it's written in an agrarian community using animals for food, but it thinks that at the beginning, God must have wanted a vegan diet for human beings. End of Genesis 1, we're given sort of fruits and seeds to eat. And so it seems like there's a sort of impatience with the kind of world in which creatures are living by the deaths of one another, and a longing for, like the Isaiah passage, and like the Romans 8 passage that I commented on in relation to John Wesley, a sort of sense that when God's will is fully done, this killing will come to an end. For me, that means that relationships of predation, even in the non-human world, look as though they're departing in some way from what would really constitute sort of full reign of God. And so in Genesis 2, where you've got Adam and Eve and the other animals living peaceably, or in Isaiah's vision, or in Paul's vision in Romans 8 of creation liberated from its bondage, it seems to me that those are all pictures of a life that even escapes that kind of predation. Now, there are other theologians like Chris Southgate, who's at Exeter in England, who say that they're so concerned to be demonstrating the congruence of theology with evolutionary biology that they want to say that predation must just be the only way God could create a world like this, and so Christians worship a God who creates through suffering and death. That seems to me so strongly at odds with key parts of biblical and theological tradition that seem to matter to me, that I don't want to go with that. And so I want to be talking in language of fallenness about a creation which is failing to manifest most fully the desire of its creator for peaceable relations. And so we have to live within a world in which lions are making their living by killing gazelles. And I'm not blaming the lions for finding themselves in that position, but I think the sort of Christian scriptures and the inheritance give us a sense of longing for the time when that predation will be over.
Hi. Yeah, actually, just to piggyback on that for a second. So the Romans 8 passage, the one, I think it's Romans 8 that's coming to mind for me, is where it talks about the entire creation is groaning, waiting for the children of God to be revealed. Mm-hmm. So, which just creates a picture in my mind that there's this like big meta-narrative in the scriptures, in the Bible, that the entire fall and redemption of the entire creation is catalyzed by the fall and redemption of man, mm-hmm. or of humankind. So in the same way that the fall of creation and the predation that happens amongst other animals was almost kind of like a fall that was catalyzed by our fall from God, in a similar way, all these animals are waiting for us to like take the lead and to start peeling back that veil between this kingdom and the next. And so it's, of course, there's, theologically we could talk about how God is the Redeemer, but we also play a role in this. And so the ball is I would suggest the ball is kind of in our court. Mm-hmm. That wasn't my question, but sorry, just piggybacking.
But I think that's a really helpful point, and that would have been a useful thing that I could have said to the campus minister too. In terms, there's nothing I'd see as problematic about anthropocentricity if it's we need to seriously take on our responsibility for managing our power in a way that would be responsible, and that's a kind of theological framing of human power, even to the extremity of affecting the whole cosmos, which doesn't look implausible in the world as we find it today. So let's just own that power and realize that we need to do a whole lot better given this influence that we have. Yeah, but go on to your question.
Yeah, amen. So, and actually that was actually the second thing I wanted to speak to. So no, that's great. It's a perfect segue into my other comment / questions. So I'm a vegan of biblical faith, and often trying to want to show my vegan friends how their veganism lines up with biblical truth and biblical faith, and also want to show my Christian and Jewish friends how their biblical faith can be really practically lived out and more fully experienced through vegan values and lifestyle. And And it seems like there's, more of kind of like the humanist or New Age kind of vegan scene sees veganism as kind of like or vegan ethics, the call to care for animals as a result of animals being on the same level as us. Whereas, stereotypically Christians will say, oh, well, we can use animals as we desire because animals are not like us. And so I actually don't shy away from that Christian idea that we are superior to animals, that we have dominion. I mean, the scriptures clearly say we have dominion, but I just think the problem is like the perversion of that dominion. And I want to make these values, intelligible within even conservative evangelical Christian theology, which actually I believe in. And I think that in accordance with that theology, we do have dominion, and it is our dominion that mandates our stewardship. So in the same way that God has dominion over us. And so I guess I'm just kind of, I appreciated that like you were, lifting animals up but kind of de-emphasizing humans, like the higher human value. But I guess in a sense I'm kind of just challenging that nuance a little bit and saying, there's nothing to be afraid of this idea that humans are, the epitome of creation and the image bearers of God, and therefore are supposed to reflect his nature, which I think is what you were saying. I guess I'm just taking a little bit of a different nuance.
Yeah, I suppose I'm absolutely, as I've said, I'm absolutely happy for us to be thinking about our unique particularity and the importance of our vocation before God to be exercising the full range of our creaturely capacities in ways that sort of manifest God's will for our lives. And so that all of that human particularity is fine. My anxiety is that we've sometimes, and it's unclear to me why we need to go beyond that to insist on this sort of wonderfully high divine status that human beings possess, because it seems to me that there's nothing that we need from that. God is gracious to us. Thank God. God cares for human beings, and that's what we need to understand from our theology fundamentally for us. But it seems to me that our insistence on this status question, which I think is related to sort of receptions of bits of Greek and Roman philosophy about sort of human status that may not be very firmly rooted in Christian scriptures, our insistence on that status has sometimes meant that we've behaved that we've thought we've have excuses for all kinds of abuse and exploitation. And so that's why I want to just slightly begin to say, all of these other creatures have their own vocation. It's not all about us. God has this diverse creaturely project and delights in this whole diverse creation, singing praises to God in their own particular creaturely ways, and we need to be recognizing our vocation as enabling that full flourishing of God's creation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was just semantics. Can I ask one more thing? Okay. So you gave a relative decent amount of time to the idea of high welfare meat, and Frank Reese being an example. And I'm just wondering, I would like to see more, or at least, or just hear your thoughts or some airtime given to, just the growth of plant-based meats and soon to come clean meat, and how there's great work being done by people like Bruce Frederick of the Good Food Institute, and it seems like that's more of the practical, accessible, mainstream solution than quote unquote high welfare meat, which I would challenge. You still have the ethical problem of the unnecessary slaughter of sentient beings under our care, which is like almost kind of like the ultimate betrayal. And so why not put a bit more emphasis on the growth of plant-based meats and soon to come plant-based meats, which really makes the raising and slaughtering of these beings completely unnecessary and maybe unjustified.
Yeah, I suppose my sense is that if we're going to engage a Christian audience at this particular moment in history with this agenda of concern for animals, it's really hard for me to see how we could avoid having to do both of these things at the same time. So a message of reducing consumption, which might be, lots of Christians going vegan as one contribution to reducing consumption. And I just blogged for Vegan Society in the UK about should Christians be vegan and setting out Christian arguments for veganism. I'm very sympathetic to that. But I think we need to take seriously that, my sense is we're starting in the middle. There are all these farmed animals, and there will be farmed animals tomorrow and the next day. And so I both want to talk about the need to make this transition towards much stronger, much more use of plants for all these reasons for human food, but also be concerned about the particular animals that are going to be in agricultural systems today and tomorrow and the next day and next year. And so I think we ought to be engaging, and I know this is sort of controversial within the sort of animals community, but I think we need to be engaging with what would make lives for those pigs that I met, in December, what would make their lives, slightly better, and reducing the number of pigs that are living in such obscene impoverishment, and increasing the number of pigs who get to live outside or and so on. I know that some people would be saying no, just go for the abolition because nothing else is going to be effective. But it seems to me both strategically in engaging Christian communities with this agenda, and also practically in relation to the animals that are going to continue to be farmed, though hopefully in decreasing numbers, we ought to be trying this complex thing of doing both of those things at the same time. And so, yes, I'm completely up for and could talk more about lots of ways of reducing consumption where we could continue to eat meat and not from animal sources. But I am committed to wanting to be concerned about farmed animal welfare as well as overall consumption, as long as we're still using animals for food.
Okay, got one last question here.
Thank you so much. I just want to return just briefly to the issue about predation, and I'll just say just for myself, I am a little not comfortable. I worry about this idea. I mean, basically because as far as I know, certain species cannot live without being carnivorous, and that's a place where I fear, that we could be projecting our own human ideas onto the animal world, I just sort of worry about things like genetically trying to change, like cats, so that they don't have to eat meat. I just, and so to. Yeah, sure. But, and then the other, really important thing about the fact that, we, in traditional sort of science, that this balance of populations by predation and how it works, it's so intricately intertwined, is to take one bit out of it, and then how are you going to indeed control the population of deer and rats if there's no predation? So I just want to take predation and sort of bracket it. We can say that we humans would like to try to find ways not to be predators ourselves, but before we start imposing, I just worry about that. That's my own.
Yeah, and I hope, I would be in favour of reintroducing wolves in Scotland as a way of contributing to this kind of re-establishing a balance in relation to deer numbers and so on. The only meat eater in my household is our cat. Because I'm not yet convinced that cats can thrive on a vegan diet. So I don't mean by raising these sort of theological concerns about a desire to overcome predatory relationships that I want to go out shooting lions, or we live in a world in which these are the relationships. Humans are predators in all kinds of ways, literally and metaphorically, and other animals are predators, and we live in this messy reality. And as you say, often things go most badly wrong when predators are missing from particular ecosystems. And so I'm not presenting that as any kind of program for engagement, but I do think Christians are sort of heir to a vision of when God's reign is fully manifest. That Edward Hicks, is Edward Hicks rather than John Hicks, isn't it? That vision of a peaceable living, that seems to me quite important, and one that I don't want to let go.
Okay, thank you all very much. We've got the room for 15 more minutes. I know we'd like to get some books signed and things like that. So David's going to be sticking around for a little while. But again, please join me in thanking Professor David Clough for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.